Welcome to the 26th Annual Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. I'm Lori Young. I'm the director of the Wilderness Institute. We sponsor this lecture series. We're part of the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the University of Montana. And the theme of this year's series is the future of wilderness in America, change, continuity, and conservation. And we've taken the opportunity of the 40th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, which occurred just last September, to look backward and think about what's changed in the last 40 years, as well as look forward to the challenges we're going to face in the future. For those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, I'd like to encourage you to pick up a schedule for the whole series. There are schedules available just outside this room on the table. We've got a lot of wonderful local as well as national level speakers who will be joining us during the semester. The next speaker for next week is actually Bill Meadows, the president of the Wilderness Society, and he'll be talking about wilderness in a red and blue world. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome our speaker for this evening, Dan Spencer, and he'll be talking about the very timely and critical issue of ecological restoration in wilderness. And here to introduce Dan tonight is Neva Hassanin, an associate professor of environmental studies here at the University of Montana.
Yep. Hi, good evening. As I was thinking about what little bit I might add to Dan's bio tonight, I was reminded of a passage that was written by David Brower, who was among the cadre of wilderness advocates who helped to pass the Wilderness Act. And this was an essay that came out a few years before he died. And he wrote, "I've had some big ideas in my life. I've made some things happen. I've stopped some misguided people from trashing the earth. But the idea I believe I will be checking out on is restoration. I've grown very fond of this planet. I want to help save a taste of paradise for our children. Give us back Hetch Hetchy and Glen Canyon, and I'll go quietly." Brower came to understand the importance of restoration late in his life, or at least stress it more late in his life. And I think it obviously raises a lot of interesting and important questions, as well as potential for action in our communities. And Dan Spencer is probably one of the best people to begin to help us understand the contours of the kinds of thinking we need to do this right, so that we aren't repeating old mistakes of hubris and thinking that we can pull it all off. And so I hope he's going to engage with some of those kinds of issues tonight. I'm sure he will. Dan was raised in California and Colorado, and he's fairly new to living permanently in Montana, but not new to Montana. He worked in Glacier National Park for many years, and he taught geology field camp in the tobacco roots. By the way, going on a drive through the landscape with Dan is incredibly fascinating for all the stories. I mean, the geological facts that he shares along the way. About the landscape and how it came to be millions of years ago. Dan was a professor of religion and ethics at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. Now he's teaching, fortunately for us here at the University of Montana, in environmental studies, liberal studies, and philosophy. He received his master's in theology and his PhD in environmental ethics from Union Theological Seminary in New York. The ideas that he's going to share with us tonight are the basis of a lot of the current work he's doing, thinking about restoration and re-inhabiting the places where we live. So I look forward to hearing more about that from him this evening. Welcome, Dan Spencer.
I'm on the portable mic. Can you hear me in the back? Is it working out there? Okay, good. I'm going to stand over here so that most of you, I'll block the slides for most of you. The title of my talk tonight is Ecological Restoration in Wilderness, Trojan Horse or Hopeful Future. And it's actually quite appropriate that Neva chose to quote David Brower at the beginning, because David Brower was one of the folks who initially saw restoration as more of a Trojan horse than a hopeful future for wilderness. And I'll talk more about why that is as we go in here. I got three primary parts to the talk tonight. And I want to talk about some of the philosophical issues at the beginning, and then go into the debates about wilderness and restoration, and then close with some proposals for community participation in restoration. So let me start with just this opening, the echo there, opening comments here. The sun strikes rust-orange tailings of the now abandoned copper mine as the group of villagers breaks into song at the Easter sunrise service, celebrating the renewal of their faith and their commitment to renewing the toxic landfill beneath their feet. Flames crackle across the open field, recently planted in corn, now returning to tall grass prairie, as college students and community members fan out to shepherd the fire through the dried grasses and recently established native plants. Local citizens pause from their efforts to uproot exotic and noxious weeds from the open space of their beloved and protected mountain slopes to take the spring green in the valley below. And residents of a low-income housing complex tend a rooftop vegetable garden and rip up and replace old concrete slabs and noxious weeds that surround the building with ecologically adapted plants. In locales as diverse as the Minnesota tallgrass prairie, the alpine valleys of the North Cascades in Washington state, and the hillsides, river valleys, and urban landscapes of western Montana, equally diverse gatherings of local community members are restoring damaged and degraded ecosystems while re-inhabiting these places with an expanded sense of home. In so doing, they reintegrate the human community into the broader natural world, and with a vision of social and ecological sustainability and a commitment to conserve and preserve wilderness as a necessary complement to this re-inhabitation. The grassroots component of the burgeoning field of ecological restoration, these communities and thousands more like them, illustrate with particular vigor and promise the vision of sustainable community that ethicist Larry Rasmussen makes the cornerstone of an earth ethic in his groundbreaking book, Community Earth Ethics. Larry Rasmussen writes that the biggest story of the 20th century is the fundamental change in the relationship of the human world to the rest of the earth. Never before have human technology and human members been powerful enough to alter and destroy planetary life systems. I'm going to pause here for just a moment. One of the joys of middle age is I now need reading glasses. Well, what I want to do is simply note here the challenge that Rasmussen poses about where we are in the current Earth here. And he writes, if the great new fact of our time is that cumulative human activity has the power to affect all life in fundamental and unprecedented ways, then what ought to be is precisely what needs to be taken into account. How ought we to live, and what ought we to do in view of a fundamentally changed human relationship to Earth, a relationship we can only partially comprehend? So as I mentioned before, I want to look at three aspects of restoration tonight. One is to introduce us to what ecological restoration is and what have been some of the philosophical issues and debates about that. And that'll bring in David Browers. So one of the things that we want to take a look at the philosophical issues around the debate. But secondly, I'd like to look at some of the debates that come out of wilderness and restoration itself, particularly some of these that are being developed by Peter Landris and his colleagues at the Leopold Institute here on campus on that. And then finally, to make an argument about community participation in restoration efforts as a particularly helpful and hopeful way of thinking about re-inhabiting our place. So those are the three main things here. And so I want to start by looking now at this philosophical debates about whether we need to think about an environmental ethic of restoration here. Before we do that, let's talk just a little bit about what we mean by ecological restoration. This is a slide that Eric Higgs has put together, and an early definition by the Society of Ecological Restoration that says restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And you'll notice he has three circles here. The actual biological, ecological processes of restoration and all the things that go into that, and I'll talk about those components. But that always takes place within a larger context, particularly the economics, restoration can be a very costly process, so it always takes place in a larger field about what's possible given economic constraints. And then Higgs and other philosophers have said we need to think of it even further as ecological restoration taking place within a historical, cultural, social, political, moral framework and aesthetic framework. All of these are important components of restoration when we bring those in. So I want to talk about that a little bit here. Some of the elements in ecological restoration then, I'll back off. Part of what it tries to do is identify a critical range of variables within biodiversity and restore these to a damaged ecosystem. Restoration tries to take ecosystems that have been damaged by human behavior and restore it to a functioning native ecosystem there. And so it needs to then look at not only at the biodiversity and the plant makeup there, but also the relevant ecological processes and structures. These could include riparian and water processes, soil, a variety of different aspects within ecosystems there. Ecological restoration uses as its data points or reference points something, a regional historical context, as we're aware ecosystems are dynamic, they change over time, and so you can't simply restore an ecosystem to some fixed point. You have to pick out an ideal point, someplace preferably prior to large human disturbance to refer to, but there's lots of debate about what that point should be. And then finally, one of the key things that we're becoming more and more aware of is that ecosystems in many places have emerged hand in hand with cultural practices of the people who inhabited them. And so reintegrating sustainable cultural practices as part of restoring ecosystems becomes an important part of the equation. Now, advocates of restoration, pull this back over here, believe that restoration links the best engagement in nature with respect for nature, and one that overcomes the human-nature dualism in that. They argue that human participation within natural systems with respect to the ecological constraints of those systems can be very, very helpful. And so by linking restoration to both conservationism, we participate in the ecology of natural habitats, and linking it with preservationism, respecting the inherent value and habitats of ecosystems. The restoration can complement and help fulfill the best parts of our environmental heritage on that. But there have been a lot of debates on restoration as a new environmental paradigm. It's one thing to argue that we can do restoration in particular places as one component of the project, but some have gone further to argue that we should think of restoration itself as a new environmental paradigm that is setting up a way for human beings to relate to our habitat, to natural systems, through a paradigm of restoration. And that's what I want to look at here very quickly here tonight. Those in favor of this, seeing restoration as a paradigm, argue that it links engagement in nature. By restoring, we're actually engaging in the process of nature itself with respect for nature. That is, our engagement, our intervention in nature is guided by nature itself. We look at pristine ecological systems and processes and use those as a way to guide our engagement in nature. One of the benefits that people argue about this is it helps us to overcome a rigid humanity-nature dualism that sees human beings as simply outside of nature and always a threat to nature. Rather, this vision reintegrates us into ecosystems as active participants within those ecosystems. And it puts a primary emphasis then on human responsibility to do this well, to do this in a way that respects the integrity of those ecosystems. So those are the folks who argue in favor of restoration as a paradigm. But there are other folks who are either cautious or skeptical about this. One of the main concerns about restoration is restoration only proceeds by intervening again in nature. That is, we use the tools of technology to try to restore native plants and ecological processes, but we have to intervene in the current systems in order to do that. And so one of the concerns is that restoration becomes simply the latest excuse, the latest justification for ongoing human intervention in nature. Part of the concern about this is nature is seen as too complex to know how to do this wisely, that we lack both the necessary knowledge about how to do it and the moral will. People have introduced technology for all sorts of good reasons in the past, but almost inevitably that technology ends up being used for damaging reasons. So people who are on the skeptical side are very concerned about our ability both technically to do it and whether we'll do it for the right reasons there. And so folks who are cautious about restoration as a paradigm emphasize, rather than human responsibility, we need to emphasize limits and ecological humility to try to really understand what's the integrity of systems there and find our place within that. Now, when ecological restoration first began to develop strongly as a field in the late 1970s, people were caught off guard by an Australian philosopher named Robert Elliott, who wrote a fairly famous article called Faking Nature. And Elliott argued that ecological restoration didn't restore nature, it gave us a fake nature there. He argued what he became known as the restoration thesis. And here I've simply quoted his article, that the destruction of what has value in nature is compensated for by the later recreation of something of equal value. Now, what's behind this was Elliott was concerned that, and he coined the term of restoration as being a Trojan horse. What he was concerned about was that restoration would now become the latest pretext for ongoing intervention in nature. And it works sort of like this. We can now have the best of both worlds. Say we have a wilderness area and it's full of copper deposits. Why don't we go in and mine the copper deposits, therefore we realize the economic value of that, and then afterwards we'll restore the wilderness to its original situation. So now we've got the wilderness value plus the economic value. And the concern was this would simply become a pretext for what we're doing, for ongoing intervention. What Elliott tried to argue is that restoration can never completely restore wilderness. What it results in is what he called a fake or a forgery. He said it's like having a good artwork, but now you're trying to replace something of value with fake nature there. And therefore you haven't actually restored the value. You've created an artificial replacement which has lesser value than wilderness would have had in the first place. And so he argued that restoration was simply the latest Trojan horse for human intervention or human industry there, that it would justify and rationalize the exploitation of nature. We can extract the value from nature and then restore and replace the original, was the concern on that. And this generated quite a bit of discussion within environmental ethics circles in the early 1980s. Elliott was followed about 10 years later by an environmental philosopher in this country named Eric Katz, who called and continues to call restoration the big lie. Okay? A similar kind of argument to Elliott's here. He debated the human restoration of nature and really saw this as a pretext for ongoing intervention in nature. Katz argued that rather than being an appropriate expression of ecological humility, finding our appropriate place within the Earth's boundaries, that restoration was simply the latest example of human pride or hubris. The idea that we have the technical ability and the know-how to restore the complexity of nature, therefore. And so, like Elliott, he argued that restoration simply will serve as justification of continued domination of nature. He argued again that restoration is not natural, that it's actually a human artifact. It exists by human intention and design, and reflects human power over nature and imposition of anthropocentric or human-centered values. Restoration can only proceed by having a blueprint of what we're trying to achieve, and that's going to inevitably reflect what humans value. And so Katz was, again, like Elliott, concerned that this would simply become the latest justification for putting a human stamp on the natural world, reshaping nature in our image rather than respecting inherent limits on that. And so the result, Katz has argued, is we'll get the increased humanization of the natural world, the limitless expansion of human power to mold and manipulate nature as we see fit. So if we want to restore it to an 1800 level or a 1600 level, we can get the scientific data. But what we're doing is artificially picking a landscape and then restoring it to that. And the concern here is that rather than being the guardians of nature, through restoration we become the gardeners of nature. We reshape nature in our image there as much as we would a garden. Got a few things that are flipping off here, but just to give you an idea that this is not a moot point. Some of you have maybe seen an article or a flyer that's come out by Friends of the Bitterroot in the last 4 or 5 weeks or so that makes precisely the same points here. It's looking at, and this is called Restoration or Exploitation, a hard look at the Bitterroot Burned Area Recovery Plan that was worked out a couple years ago between environmentalists, the Forest Service, and industry folks in response to the recovery for the Bitterroot 2000 fires. These folks are arguing that under the promise of restoration, which really has taken place, has been another pretext for further logging there. And so they've examined carefully the Bitterroot Burned Area Recovery Plan. The promise, of course, was that this would lead to forest restoration, fire reduction, and community protection. That was the promise of the plan, and there was a timeline under which this would be developed there. What folks have pointed out is that far from this has happened here. Instead, the reality has been using the Burn Area Recovery Plan as a pretext to log the largest trees, fire risk has increased, actual restoration work avoided, and environmental damage is ongoing. There's a big article in the Missoulian just a couple weeks ago that made this point here. Some of the things that they argued about is that less than 20% of the promised restoration has taken place, while over 80% of the logging has gone here. Part of the debates about what's happened in here is that much of the money that was allegedly set aside for restoration was instead expropriated for use in fire prevention and firefighting the following summer, so there's simply no more funds left for restoration. But it's confirmed the concern of many environmentalists that the talk of restoration simply ends up becoming one more pretext for logging, one more pretext for ongoing intervention. And so this is, I think, a current example of restoration as a Trojan horse in that sense. So the summary of the critiques here. One is that restoration doesn't lead to a restored wildness. It actually fakes nature. It creates a human artifice rather than natural systems there. That restoration must use technology, and therefore it ends up mirroring destructive technological patterns. Critics of restoration have argued that if technology is one of the main causes for the problems we have in environmental degradation, why would we rely on technology to resolve it? Better to trust the ecological wisdom of Earth itself and let natural resources or processes restore themselves rather than employ technology for that. And then again, restoration is really simply a pretext for exploitation in this argument here. One of the main concerns, and when Neva introduced me using David Brower's quote, this is one of his concerns early on. The concern is that restoration will deflect attention from conservation and preservation, that there's a limited amount of environmental energy and resources, and what we should be focusing on is further preserving what's left and conserving parts of nature, and restoration leads us, it deflects that attention from that. I don't know why this, one thing I've got is flipping off the top, but anyway, the title of the next talk there is a response to this. And one of the responses comes from Andrew Light, who's also an environmental philosopher and ethicist there, and argues for an environmental pragmatism. He argues that Robert Elliott and Eric Katz have been helpful in pointing out the potential malicious aspects of restoration, that it can indeed function as this kind of pretext, but it doesn't need to. And so what Andrew Light argues is we need to distinguish between what he calls malicious restoration that's used to justify exploitation and benevolent restoration, which is used to remedy past human harms to nature. That in fact we have a moral responsibility to clean up after ourselves, to remedy these harms there. And so he argues against Katz that rather than creating human artifice, what restoration of natural conditions and processes does is it frees nature from human domination. We can restore ecosystems to a certain point and then let natural processes take over, freed up now from the effects of human domination. And so Light argues that we can be partners with nature. We're not trying to impose ourselves on natural processes, but work with them in the chance to heal the land there. And so then the restoration of both nature itself and an important part of the human relationship with non-human nature, we can overcome the strict humanity-nature dualism. Part of the real promise of restorationists is that in order to effectively participate in restoration activities, one has to understand the natural world and natural processes very closely. And so we gain a great deal of knowledge as we participate with those processes, and we close that gap between humanity and the natural world there. So part of the important effects of restoration is not only on natural ecosystems, it's the effects it has on us in empowering us to become part of these ecosystems here. This was supposed to say the response of another philosopher, Eric Higgs. Eric Higgs has probably been the most consistent philosopher of ecological restoration. He's also a past president of the Society for Ecological Restoration, which I think it's got to be one of the only times that you have a philosopher who is the president of a scientific society. But he's done a lot of work on this. And he argues against these arguments here, against Robert Elliott's argument about fakery. Higgs argues that restoration is about assisted recovery. It's not about creation of artifacts, but rather restoring ecological processes themselves and integrating ourselves within that as a co-creative process. And then against Katz's argument that restoration simply mirrors destructive technological patterns, he argues that they're again, like Andrew Light, we can look at malicious or damaging forms of restoration, but we can also look at positive or benign ones there. And what Higgs is going to argue is we need to focus on what he calls participatory restoration that engages those of us who participate and benefit natural processes. And that'll be really the focus of my third part of the talk tonight. So both Higgs and Light argue that we should see restoration as both and rather than either or. That restoration underscores the importance of preservation and conservation of ecosystems, but we can complement that with restoration here. And I'll talk a little bit further about what I mean by that. So we don't have to choose between conservation, preservation, or restoration. We can see these complementing each other in those areas there. Some have taken this even further. Probably the most prominent, probably William Jordan, has in a book called The Sunflower Forest, has argued that restoration we should really adopt this as the environmental paradigm. And part of his argument is that the vast majority of the Earth's surface area already has been deeply shaped by human habitation and will continue to be. That wilderness is important, but wilderness is a very small fraction of it. So if we're going to really think about an environmental paradigm that the majority of the Earth can participate in, restoration can be that paradigm. We can figure out how to inhabit or re-inhabit our places more carefully there and develop restoration as a way of developing an ethic of re-inhabitation. Part of Jordan's arguments here is that restoration gives us the basis of developing a positive ethic of hope, human participation. Rather than focusing all our efforts on preserving increasingly shrinking areas that end up feeling a very, very defeated environmental ethic, here we can focus still on preserving those areas, but proactively engage in restoring the areas that we inhabit. And so it involves a lot more people in a positive project for how we can do that here. And at the end of the talk tonight, I'll introduce Graham Bonk, who's going to talk about some of the local efforts that are going on with Five Valleys Land Trust, as well as some other things that I think exemplify this. And then some have taken this even further to argue that restoration can now become the basis of our whole economic paradigm. Storm Cunningham, who's the author of the Restoration Economy, says that restorative development is the new economic paradigm, that we're shifting our economy away from extractive resources and more to restoring what we've already developed. And so seeing restoration as a basis for rethinking our economy. Any of you who know the work of Tom Powers, the chair of the economics department here in the University of Montana, know that he's made a similar argument for the function of wilderness in the Western Montana economy. That wilderness, in addition to being an economic or an ecological and aesthetic resource, is also an economic resource. It draws people into areas and helps create healthy, vibrant economic communities. And so wilderness itself can be part of a restoration paradigm in that sense. So let me shift now to the second part of the talk, and here are some of the debates that are ongoing in light of these philosophical debates about whether we should be involved in restoration in wilderness. And I see some of my friends who were at a conference recently that was put on here on forestry, or the forest and the restoration here. The key question that emerges in this debate here is restoration appropriate in wilderness? Now, part of the underlying reality is a lot of wilderness exists currently in an ecologically degraded situation, or does not exist in a pre-disturbance pattern there. And so the challenge in looking at wilderness is how do we preserve both wildness and naturalness as key values that we hold for wilderness? How do we preserve both wildness and naturalness as key values? I'm drawing the next several slides here from a talk that Peter Landris has developed from the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute here on the U of M campus. He's looked intensively at this issue here, at the dilemma of managing for wildness and naturalness in wilderness. Now, I'll explain in a minute why I think why Peter thinks this is a dilemma, and I agree with him on that. But part of the concern is that if when we begin to look at wilderness itself, we value both wildness and naturalness. Wildness and naturalness. And the quote here from Lauren Guy Waterman's Wilderness Ethics, I think sums this up nicely. Once land is designated as wilderness, how do we preserve the spirit of the land? That is, its wildness and its naturalness. He puts it up that the problem of wilderness reserves here is only Gary Larson can I think, give it here. Increasingly, our wilderness preserves are smaller and smaller pieces of land that are preserved from the parting there here. And we've got several problems in wilderness. There's increasing use of all types going on in wilderness. We've got increasing region-wide threats and development of adjacent lands. All you need to do is look at the area around Yellowstone, the area around Glacier, around the Bob Marshall, and see the increasing development of the surrounding areas there. And then what we're seeing increasingly, not only adjacent to wilderness, but in wilderness itself, the increasing disruption of ecological processes, a loss of species. So it brings up the question, should we actively try to restore these in wilderness areas here? Several different problems we can begin to see. A century of fire prevention has led to accumulated fuels in an unnatural state, so that when fires do break out in wilderness, they're often catastrophic and very destructive of biological diversity in soils there. We see the spread of non-native invasive plants that don't respect wilderness boundaries and are going on in the areas themselves there. We've also got fragmentation is causing wildlife extinction in various different areas. This is a case, for example, of the southwestern deserts and the bighorn sheep that are going extinct because they don't have large enough habitat in the area there. So the question then that gets posed is, increasingly we have the technology, we have the ability to carry out restoration efforts in wilderness, but should we? We can restore natural conditions. By natural conditions, we mean largely pre-European disturbance in these areas, by reducing fuels, by spraying herbicides, by providing water. That is, by actively intervening in these wilderness areas. We can return some of the natural conditions, but only by compromising the wildness, by actively intervening in areas that we think of as belonging as wild. And so part of the dilemma comes out of the Wilderness Act of 1964, to which this series is dedicated, which asks us to preserve both values. A wilderness, in the definition of wilderness, a wilderness is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. One of those famous words, untrammeled, that came out of very, very careful wording there. Trammeling is the image of what you use for controlling livestock. You put a trammel on them to control and steer them. And so wilderness is supposed to be untrammeled. It's not supposed to be controlled and steered by human efforts there. It's supposed to be, the value of wildness is expressed in the uncontrolled, unrestrained, the self-willed nature of wilderness. Wilderness can take care of itself. But we also have in the Wilderness Act there, an area of wilderness is further defined as retaining its primeval character and influence, which is protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions here. And by natural here, we usually mean native ecological compositions, structures, and functions, the native ecosystems, pre-disturbance in that area there. And the question becomes, since much of this wilderness is already compromised in this, does it become justified to use technological techniques on behalf of naturalness, knowing that it will compromise wildness? So if we look at these two core wilderness values, wildness as being freedom from human control and manipulation, naturalness as return of the native species patterns and processes there. We can, what Peter Landis has done, I think, is helpfully kind of map these two against each other there. So here we're going from low to high levels of naturalness, native ecosystems. Here we're going from low to high levels of wildness, that is, degrees of human intervention there. The goal, of course, is wilderness is high naturalness and high wildness. And so wilderness is both the idea and the place where wildness and naturalness reach their highest expression. And we mean this both as a reality, that is, it's a living reality on the ground there, where you have high or lack of human intervention and natural ecosystems. But it also expresses the values of what we're trying to reach. These are human values of what we value in a particular landscape or ecosystem. Now, you can imagine then in contrast here a couple different things. A city park can vary from very low naturalness, importing all the ornamental fruit trees from Europe, for example, But it could also be a high expression of naturalness. You can imagine a city park that's done completely in native plants, native ecosystems. So in that case, you'd have a high degree of naturalness, but a low degree of wildness. It's a heavenly human-controlled system in that sense there. So in this case, you've restored naturalness, but at the cost of wildness. Or imagine a vacant city lot, right? A place that's simply been abandoned. There, you can imagine a high degree of wildness. No one's paying any attention to it. That city lot's doing whatever it wants to, free of intervention. But probably a very low degree of naturalness. It's filled with weeds, non-natives, these kinds of things. And so the question then becomes, how do we maximize both wildness and naturalness in our wilderness areas here? And as I mentioned before, we can imagine, if you look up there, this is what the typical ponderosa pine forest is supposed to look like with natural fire regimes, that kind of open understory. There's a lot of debate, of course, to how much these have actually existed here. But in terms of a wilderness ideal, where you have frequent low-intensity burning fires that clear the understory and leave mature stands, that's what we'd be looking for, say, in a wild and natural ponderosa pine forest where fire has been restored. But our current situation in many forests is accumulation of a lot of fuels in these areas there. So we've got a very low naturalness and low wildness, a lot of human intervention, and a lot of growth of non-native species and non-native ecosystems there. So the question becomes, what becomes justified now if we want to restore it to a natural condition? And you can see several different possibilities. One is intentionally going and introducing fire there, as they're doing there. In the upper photograph there, he's actually raking the duff away from the base of the tree, because when these ground cars come through now, they burn so hot, they can kill the cambium layer on the trees there if you don't pull that away. Or actual mechanical thinning of the forest prior to fire. All of these will help to restore the natural conditions, but involve a lot of intensive intervention, compromising the wildness of wilderness in those areas there. Or you can let nature take its course, not intervene at all. But we've seen increasingly in the West what happens with high-intensity fires that develop into crown fires, and then further compromise both the wildness and the naturalness in the area when you end up with a sterile, high-intensity burned forest area that may take decades, if not centuries, to recover. So we've got some real challenging possibilities here if, again, we're trying to reach our wilderness ideal of both high wildness and high naturalness. So here, these are examples that Peter's put up there. We can see we can reduce fuels to restore natural fire regimes and fire effects, a variety of different ways to do that. We can eradicate weeds to restore native plants and plant communities. I asked my class this morning, what's the color of Missoula hillsides in May around here? Anybody know? Purple, all right? It's the spotted knapweed is everywhere. And with the vast, extensive amount of exotic weeds that are going on, there's a limitation to what you can actually control by hand pulling, without using chemicals. So the question becomes, does it become justified to use chemical treatment as part of the integrated exotic treatment in weeds there? And that becomes even more complex when you start talking about wilderness. One of the big issues in the desert Southwest, should they fly in water reservoirs to keep bighorn sheep populations alive? To actually stock the wilderness with water, because wilderness becomes so fragmented, the bighorn sheep can't migrate from one mountain range to another to get water when they need it. And so without intervening to provide water, bighorn sheep will go extinct in those areas. Another one here, my partner is very involved in this, bitterroot restoration. Should we use greenhouse-raised rust-resistant seedings to restore white bark pine forests? Big problem with white bark pine rust, decimating white bark pine, which in turn affects grizzly bear populations, a variety of other things here. We have the technology now to restore those white bark pine forests using greenhouse-raised seedlings that are rust resistant. But obviously that compromises the wildness of a wilderness area if you're introducing that into there. So we have the technological means. The question becomes, should we do this, and what are the consequences? So as a way of framing this kind of starkly, Peter Landers has developed this slide that sort of shows the opposing sides here, keeping in mind that these are the extremes for the sake of argument here. If the goal is wildness, then manipulation is simply not justified for any reason. If we've set aside wilderness areas to preserve wildness primarily, you can't simply go in and use human intervention in wilderness areas, even if you have a good goal. The ethical thinking behind this is two wrongs don't make a right. Let nature heal itself. Opposing this would be if your dominant concern is naturalness. What's really critical in wilderness areas is to restore them to pre-disturbance natural ecosystems. Then manipulation is justified to restore naturalness. In fact, it's not only justified, it's our responsibility. We damaged it. We have the responsibility to use our best means to restore it. It's part of that concern there. If the wildness one, our advocates would argue that current problems are deemed acceptable. They may not be desired. We don't like what has happened to wilderness, but intervention has caused the problem. So don't justify further intervention to try and remedy it. Let nature heal itself. In the goal of naturalness, current problems themselves are deemed as unacceptable. We've got to do something. We've created a problem that's caused a lot of things, therefore it's up to us to resolve it. Concern on the wildness side here, you really see a lot of the precautionary principle you may have talked about coming here. The potential results of an action may be worse than the results of inaction. So the first rule is simply do no harm. We have all sorts of examples of things we thought we were doing. We introduce a species to do biological control of pests, and then that pest takes off and becomes a new pest there. So we have lots of examples of well-intentioned intervention in nature going awry and making the situation worse than it was. On the other hand, the natural side there says, look, the situation is already in such a situation that if we don't intervene, it will not resolve itself. You're not going to get rid of spotted knapweed, at least in human course of time here in wilderness areas, simply by letting evolution take its course. And therefore, the potential results of inaction may be worse than the results of action. Doing something is better than nothing. If you've got a 5-acre patch of leafy spurge in the wilderness area, you better get the bulldozer out or something to get that leafy spurge out of there. If you don't, it'll be 1,000 acres, 50,000 acres. So simply waiting will make the situation worse in that sense there. Final thing here, the phrase wilderness management in the wilderness perspective is simply an oxymoron. It's a phrase where two terms contradict themselves. We manage people, not wilderness. It's inappropriate to use a management paradigm when thinking about wilderness. The naturalist side would argue that wilderness management is not an oxymoron, that we manage both people in wilderness and wilderness itself. And in fact, management simply becomes a requirement. The wilderness can no longer exist or can't exist in its current reduced state without ongoing human presence in it. And so we need to be thoughtful about it, but it's unavoidable. And so some of the ethical questions that come up in this does manipulation compromise the core value of wildness? And what are we talking about? There's a whole spectrum of degrees of manipulation. You could be sending in a crew of the Boy Scouts to hand pull weeds on a hillside. Or you could be sending in folks to apply aerial spraying of pesticides. Both of them are intervention. To what degree can we do it without compromising wildness so much that we've really harmed wilderness? Is manipulation justified when used to restore the impacts of prior manipulation? A lot of the concern is that we have our ongoing human effects that continue to exist in wilderness areas. So is it justified now to manipulate those areas in order to try to return them to a pre-disturbance state? Similarly, is short-term trammeling of wilderness justified to restore long-term natural processes? This is really a tough one. How much of wilderness is compromised indefinitely by a short-term intervention in there? I was posing to one of my classes recently how this dilemma came up in a somewhat different way. The Bush administration was ruling on the proposed geothermal project. One of the concerns was that the geothermal project was taking place in the area of Native American vision quests. The Clinton administration had turned down the geothermal project for precisely that reason. They said it's simply not justified to destroy these sacred sites. The Bush administration's argument was different. They said since the geothermal plant is only going to last 50 years, this is a short-term interruption of religious practices. Once it's done, we can restore the site and Native Americans can go back to doing their vision quests there. Now, you can see that the dilemma here, and again, about how restoration can be argued as a Trojan horse in this area here, asking Native Americans whether a 50-year period of having a geothermal plant on their vision quest sites might harm that site more than simply the 50 years is another question. But that becomes relevant when we start thinking about intervention in wilderness for the sake of naturalness here. And then finally, does the ecological value of naturalness outweigh the social value of wildness? Keep in mind here, wildness is a social value. It's a value that we project on or experience in areas that are largely free of human disturbance. Where naturalness is much more of an ecological value. we can examine what pristine ecosystems are, use reference sites, and come up with an understanding of what a natural condition is vis-a-vis other historic sites there. So what's more important when we think about wilderness? The natural ecosystem of pre-disturbance there, or are the value that we have of particular places that uphold wildness in them? And then finally, here's the term I used before: must we accept, even reluctantly, the gardenification of wilderness and become gardeners rather than guardians? And part of it, when Peter Landris does this talk, he does just a brilliant job of showing once you've taken that first step, well, we'll just put out a few tubs of water for the bighorn sheep. Well, we'll just go in and we'll bulldoze a whole hillside to get a water runoff system for that. Well, we'll go in and we'll actually start piping the water in. That once you take the first step of compromising wildness, it becomes easier and easier to do more. Every one of them with a good, well-justified reason about why you want to do it. But pretty soon you have a pretty thoroughly reshaped landscape that may have restored the natural values, but may no longer have much value in terms of wildness. And so these are really difficult issues to think about. Lori, how are we doing on time? 5 or 10 more minutes, or should I just close it here for conversation?
5 would be fine.
5 minutes? Okay. Let me go through just a couple examples here of what I think of the third one here, because I want to argue that restoration actually can complement wilderness when we start thinking about different ways of doing it here. And so I'll argue about restoration as a paradigm for re-inhabiting place sustainably. And these are the different features that I would argue in this area here. The wilderness now becomes a special aspect of re-inhabiting place. That not all places have to be re-inhabited the same way, and we can think of re-inhabiting place as also restraining from re-inhabiting some places, and wilderness is part of that. Wilderness then becomes a very important symbol of human restraint and humility. That it's the parts in our re-inhabitation of our homes, it becomes the part that we choose not to there. So it's part of re-inhabitation, but it's re-inhabitation through restraint there. And then David Brower, and when he initially opposed to restoration, but eventually came to see it as a very important part of wilderness, he called it wilderness CPR, conservation, preservation, and restoration as being integrated aspects of that. And I'm going to just go through a few of these slides here. I was going to talk a little bit about more Albert Borgman's work on technology. This is what we want to avoid. This is using Western restoration efforts to create artificial wilderness. Have any of you been to the Wilderness Lodge that Disney's put together in Florida? You can go have the complete wilderness experience in Florida because they have used the tools of ecological restoration to build a lodge and create the perfect ecosystem there. So that's what we call bad restoration. All right? That's what we're trying to avoid here. But I think we can begin to look at what another philosopher, Eric Higgs, talks about as focal restoration, or what I sometimes talk about as participatory restoration, where we're looking to recover human participation in nature, which of course, given our evolutionary history, has been the dominant paradigm. Human beings and human cultures have long participated in their landscapes in largely sustainable ways. In doing this, we begin to reintegrate our social dimension into the ecological fabric. We see who we are as social creatures as part of a larger ecological fabric in that sense. And I'll argue that this can provide us with some ethical guidelines or ethical norms for how to do this. I agree with William Jordan in this sense that this can provide us with a very constructive ethic of hope and ecological agency. We don't have to see human beings as simply creatures that inevitably damage ecosystems, that we can have a positive, proactive state in actually restoring ecosystems through this participatory model here. First case I'm going to use is Missoula. And I think Missoula is really a wonderful case study for what has been happening here. Back in the early 1980s, Missoulians became very concerned about protecting open space. And so through some progressive bond issues, they formed a Citizens Advisory Committee in 1991. Out of this, in 1995, a $5 million bond was passed for open space. And many of you in the room probably remember this history here, the concern that a lot of Missoula space was being rapidly fragmented and developed here. But after open space was protected, a new threat emerged. This open space was rapidly becoming filled not with native plants, which we had hoped to preserve, but with exotic noxic weeds. And so what's been interesting is to see how now, and here's examples: spotted knapweed, Dalmatian toadflax, and leafy spurge being three of the most pernicious in this area here. But the Missoula community now has engaged in a variety of different activities to try to restore not only open space as open, but open space as healthy native ecosystems here. And so we see a model now that's trying to integrate different parts of the community. Some of you may know Marlene Marler, who coordinates the weed efforts here on the campus here, integrating a lot of folks from the university, the city, the county, and volunteers. Doing this also by educating people about native plants and how to do this. So people become much more informed. Instead of simply preserving open space for the aesthetic values, we're becoming educated about the ecological values of healthy ecosystems in those open spaces and participating in that. And so this is just simply one of the programs I like. They developed the Adopt a Switchback program on the M Trail, where different grade schools and stuff like that, fraternities, are taking different aspects and taking responsibility for the ecological health of a piece of the hillside. It's a small effort, but it's one that I think has real potential for increasingly involving the community to understand what it means to re-inhabit a place with a healthy ecosystem there. Okay, second one. This is my alma mater, Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. I think has done some really interesting work about community participation in re-inhabiting there around its arboretum there. Carleton is a small liberal arts institution on the former tallgrass prairie in the Midwest there. About 100 years ago, they set aside 900 acres of this in an arboretum. And starting about 15 years ago, they began to really actively begin to restore the prairie. I was in on some of the earliest projects in the 1970s when we thought if we simply burned these areas, prairie would pop back. That was early stages of restoration. We've since discovered that restoring prairie is a much more complicated effort. But the initial efforts were very important for establishing the principle of trying to bring back native ecosystems. And the goal has been to restore ecological integrity, indigenous ecosystems in these areas. 10 years ago, 1995, the college committed to a systematic restoration plan and began to implement it in stages there. They're taking 8 to 10 acres per year of former agricultural land and restoring it into tallgrass prairie. These are just some of the different folks who are participating. They involve local school children. They involve a lot of the classes of the college, alumni events, and local community participation. And the point here is they're really thinking broadly about bringing lots of different aspects of the community to get hands-on involvement in the restoration efforts there. This is one of the things that I thought was really great. They had a big problem with buckthorn, invasive buckthorn throughout all the Oak Savannah area there. So they developed the Oak Savannah Restoration Project. This is what the buckthorn looks like before it's cleared out. Here they've gone through and cleared all of it out there. And then they took all the buckthorn and they created a campus sculpture out of it. And so on the middle of campus for 2 years was the former buckthorn, this big, what they call twigonometry sculpture. But it was used as taking restoration into art and educating the community about why they were doing this. Last case here, 2 more minutes, we'll finish up here. Another community that I've been very involved in, Holden Village, is a former mining community in the North Cascades of Washington State. It's an in-holding in the Glacier Peak Wilderness area. And so it about 40 years ago was given to the Lutheran Church, which now operates it as a retreat center. But they have taken on the restoration of the mine tailings as a really important part of this. These pictures here show the old mine. From the 1930s and 1950s, it was second only to the Butte Anaconda copper complex. Here is the largest copper complex in North America. The legacy was it left over 90 acres and 8.5 million tons of very toxic mine tailings that sit in the middle of the wilderness there. And then was given to the Lutheran Church. This is what it looks like when it was still the bright orange and it had kind of rusted. Part of the problem is wind erosion. These tailings blow, and they blow into Lake Chelan and the water systems there and get into the aquifer. And so you can see just some of the early efforts there. There shows the winds when it blows across the tailings. This is the village itself right here, and the mine tailings sit right on the other side there. Railroad Creek, which drains into Lake Chelan, one of the most pristine lakes in North America, runs right along the base of the tailings. So real active problem here with mine tailings on that. And then Lake Chelan is at the base of the valley. So part of what the village has been working with the Forest Service and the former mine companies, first to stabilize the tailings. They spread a lot of gravel pits on top there, and then to try to get vegetative islands to begin to grow again on top of them. They've stabilized the banks along the base there, and eventually they're going to try and remove several of the tailings here. But what's been very interesting for me about the way Holden does this, as a Lutheran or ecumenical Christian community, they've integrated restoration of the the tailings into what they call their ethic of stewardship. They see this as part of God's, or their response to God's being caretakers of God's good earth, to actually now restore the tailings. And so part of the things they'll do Easter sunrise services up on the tailings with the image of the resurrection now, that this wilderness will one day be resurrected again, and the toxic residue of the tailings will be overcome. All right, I think I'm just going to stop there. Let's just open it up for questions. These are a few of, if we talk about some of the norms, the ethical guidelines, starting with ecological sustainability, social justice, participation, our own agency, and respect for non-human nature. These would be 5 critical components that I would argue should be involved in participatory restoration. If we start thinking about what it takes to do good restoration, as opposed to using restoration as a pretext for exploitation. Those are some of the things that we can do there. So I would argue the following things here to conclude: that participatory restoration is a hopeful model. They both build sustainable community and wilderness. It integrates restoration back into conservation and preservation. So humans are both guardians and gardeners, but it becomes important where we are. We're guardians of wilderness. We're gardeners of our places that we've re-inhabited. And wilderness becomes that part of our re-inhabitation of place where we recognize our limits and keep our hands off. So our final goal is this wilderness CPR, conservation, preservation, and restoration into one ethic. And so I will stop here. And I think we have time for questions then and discussion. Yep. If I stand out here, are we away from the echo?
That's better, yeah.
Okay, good. So have at me. This is still very much a work in progress. I'm trying to formulate an ethic about this, so I appreciate any feedback you have. Yes?
I just have a question about your comments on the burn area recovery plan.
Yeah.
It seems like the problem there really is an issue of accountability and an issue of how the administrative state operates, just as much as it is an issue of restoration.
Yeah. Say more about that.
I kind of point that out and wonder if you could say some more about participation, not only in restoration, but in the governance efforts to make sure that restoration happens.
You know, that whole case study would take too long to review all the dates of it, but the initial burn area recovery plan was so contested by environmentalists because they felt it really was simply becoming an excuse for further logging in these burned areas, that it really bogged down and went to the courts. And the courts ordered all the relevant parties to, in a kind of a lockdown situation, to come to a consensus about how to proceed. There was real promise coming out of that, because one of the things that came out of that was the real importance of ecological restoration, along with some timber harvesting in some ways there. And what unfortunately has resulted instead has been disillusionment about the degree to which the logging continued and the restoration has been put on hold. And so I think the reason I brought it up here is that people who are disillusioned about that really feel now that the promise of restoration was simply held out there as a way of getting them to go along with the plan and participate, when in fact it hasn't resulted. If you talk to agency folks, they feel very frustrated. They feel like they're being maligned because they feel like they did commit to the restoration, and it wasn't their fault that Washington pulled out the funds that were designated for restoration and dedicated them to fighting fires, particularly in the 2002-2003 fire seasons. So it's a very interesting case. I think it is very complex. But I do think it, in answer to your second part of your question, it does open up some possibilities for further human participation, not only in the actual hands-on restoration work, but the work with agencies in helping to design this. You may have seen a couple weeks ago out in the paper there was an editorial by folks at the Alliance for the Wild Rockies and a couple of the other forestry groups about a new set of forest restoration principles that they are putting together, that they are proposing to the agencies to guide restoration efforts in the national forest. And I think there's a really good example about community participation, grassroots participation in guiding this. It'll be interesting to see whether the forest and the other agencies pick up on this proposed things there. They've got a restoration site out near Ovando that they're working on to try to illustrate putting into practice these principles on that. Does that get to your question? I think both aspects of participation are really important, both the hands-on efforts where we really get our fingers dirty and we're that, but also in the policy efforts, because if restoration is going to take over as a paradigm, it has to involve the government, has to be broad scale, it's going to take a lot of resources, and that's where we really have to work in participating with government as opposed to simply turning it over to them on that. Up in the far back there. Is there any way to turn this light out here, or does that have to stay on, the projector light? Can we turn the projector itself off? If you can, just because it's shining directly in my eyes here. Yeah?
The examples of restoration outside the wilderness that you gave, I think not too many people would have these objections to those. As far as restoration within wilderness, which is, as you suggested, a lot more complicated, harder to examine. The sort of dilemma between naturalness and wildness, I don't have a copy of the Wilderness Act map. It seems like you read the whole section that those two sentences are taken from in the context of the whole paragraph. It really seems like that the authors of the Wilderness Act came down pretty strongly on the side of wildness. When you read the whole section, I'm just wondering if you read it that way, and whether you take that dilemma as proposed there is maybe not a dilemma if you're truly a wilderness advocate.
You may well be right that the actual authors themselves were strong advocates of wildness, and that's where the emphasis came down. But I think in fairness to both current wilderness managers, folks who had to do this, and recognizing where folks were in the 50s and 60s, there was simply a whole slew of problems with the ecological health of wilderness that couldn't be anticipated at that point. We didn't have any understanding, or nearly the understanding we do today about the role of fire in wilderness and the constructive role. And so fire suppression in wilderness continued to where we got in a very, very difficult situation. The problem of exotic weeds was certainly there, but nothing nearly the pervasiveness that we have now. The fragmentation of area outside of wilderness has meant the compromising of ecological or healthy ecological conditions in a lot of wildernesses themselves. And so I think the tension is really real between, yes, the vision is to protect the wildness of these places, but not simply at the expense of the naturalness itself. I mean, naturalness is also part of what needs to be incorporated in that. And so I think the very real dilemma is what are the best ways to do that? How can we act in such a way as to maximize both of them? Do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, isn't naturalness itself a human concept?
It definitely is. Naturalness, the question is, isn't naturalness itself a human concept? Yes and no. I mean, it is a naturalness. Well, say more what you think about what you mean by the question.
I guess like you're making this big push for naturalness and protecting naturalness and doing that through restoration. And while wildness, you said, I think you said that was more of a human concept.
Yeah, more of a social value, right.
But naturalness is also because, like if you think about it, nature is always changing, it's dynamic. And so for us to try to stop that or to try to prevent change, even if like we think it's bad, then that in itself.
Yeah. And what this gets to, and I think you're exactly right, what this gets to is what your perspective is on human-induced change in natural. And is that human-induced change within the bounds of what can be absorbed within the ecosystems? So clearly human beings have been interacting with landscapes for thousands of years, where I taught in Iowa for 10 years a lot of human effort in prairie fire, of actually shaping, starting the prairie there. The question I think becomes is, does this human-induced change, can it be absorbed within the ecological parameters or conditions of the landscapes, or does it reach a certain point where it so significantly compromises them that you move into what we call an unnatural regime, or something that simply has no historical reference point to it here? But the point that you make about naturalness, what becomes so difficult sometimes for restoration is that because nature is dynamic, constantly changing, you have to pick a reference point. Are we referring to the Little Ice Age conditions of the 1880s? Are we referring back to the 1600s? Do we even have the information about what things looked like in those eras there? But what restoration advocates responded there is they're not trying to restore a static snapshot. You may have a reference point you're trying to return to, but then you're also restoring ecological processes. And so what you're trying to do is to give ecological process a kind of a fighting chance to do it on their own. The recognition is that some landscapes, some ecosystems are so compromised that they simply won't do it on their own. That, for example, maybe a better example is where I taught in Iowa. Iowa is the most ecologically altered state in the nation. For about 80% of the surface area has been converted from tallgrass prairie into monocrop agriculture. You could stop the agriculture tomorrow, take all of the farms up, and you aren't going to get the prairie back. The prairie simply won't regenerate on its own there because of the significant alteration. So if we want tallgrass prairie, we have to go back and intervene in a variety of different ways to make that happen, at least initially. And just one response to your other question there, I mean, I agree with you. On one hand, these examples don't seem that controversial. But you should have seen the reaction in Iowa when they tried to take out of 36 million acres of farmland, tried to restore 8,000 acres of tallgrass prairie. I mean, the outrage that all this land that hard-working pioneers had plowed under to make productive farmland was now being wasted and turned back into prairie. But it was really, really interesting. And so, you know, every particular ecosystem and region has its own understanding about what's culturally acceptable and desirable. And this, in the middle of Iowa, was seen as really a slap in the face to all our ancestors who worked so hard to make that land productive, to return it to prairie there. But I think social and natural in some ways themselves are kind of artificial categories. They overlap. There's a social component, natural component to both of them. The difference is, I think in natural, we can actually, you know, use the tools of ecological sciences to understand ecosystems in fairly complex ways, and then use those as baselines of what we return them to. Whereas in wildness, of course, this is a lot of the debate there. If any of you know William Cronin's work and the trouble with wilderness, you know, some people have argued that wildness itself is simply a Western European construct. That Native Americans have participated in the landscapes, as have many peoples around the world themselves, without making this artificial distinction between wilderness and the rest of the thing. But for better or for worse, that's the framework we have in this country, both our legal framework and our cultural framework. And so we work with that in some sense to figure out how to develop it. Yes?
So going back to the actual phrasing in the Wilderness Act, how would you respond to the very next sentence after preserving its natural conditions, which continues to say, and which generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable?
Yeah. What do you mean, how would I respond to that?
It would seem to me that there shouldn't be much of a conflict, because as long as you do it in a way that manages to make it substantially unnoticeable, that it fits precisely within the phrasing of the act itself.
So you're saying that you could intervene as long as it's largely unnoticeable?
Yeah, I don't understand what the conflict is.
Yeah. Neva, you want to?
Spraying pesticides is pretty unnoticeable. I mean, and so we contaminate water in wilderness. I mean, what do we need? I mean, I think you have, still the debate is there. Is that something we would want to do?
Yeah. And there's real spectrums of it as well. I mean, in many of the places, for example, where forest density has gotten so thick, the best thing to do is to go in and hand thin. But that's a very human-intensive activity, to go in and be cutting down all the shrubs and getting the shrub piles and so forth. Is that acceptable? Are we talking about a short-term range of acceptability there? And I think what your question points out is there's really a spectrum of events, a range of different events that we can begin to look at there. But because I think it points to the deeper problem, because ecosystems have become so compromised in some really fundamental ways, we have to make some very difficult choices. How important is it to either reintroduce species that were there before, such as wolves, or to maintain threatened species there if the only way you can maintain them is by actively and continually intervening in the area there? And their value choices. There's no necessarily absolute right or wrong question on that. Peter Landis showed a wonderful example in his slideshow about maintaining the bighorn sheep, where they went in and they actually dug up about a couple acre plot there, and they put in the ground these big water tanks. And then they funneled a whole water catchment system up into a dry riverbed, so that when the floods came, all that water would be channeled underground into these tanks. And once they were done, you couldn't tell they'd done it. You couldn't tell they'd done it. But now you have a wilderness that has an irrigation system And it's unnoticeable, but it's definitely out there. It's collecting the water, it's channeling in these tanks, and it bubbles up to the surface of these bighorn sheep. Is that acceptable in wilderness? It's certainly not a wild condition, but now it's at a point where it's not very noticeable. Although we don't know the effects. What's the effects of channeling all the water from a stream bed for one species? What happens to the rest of that? And so, I think every case, there's a variety of different issues we have to look at there. But I agree with you, the Wilderness Act gives us guidelines. It just doesn't answer it for us. There was a hand, yeah.
Going back to what you were saying a little bit earlier about trying to restore an area that's already been highly compromised, wouldn't you say that intervening in an area like that would actually be inhibiting the adaptation of ecological processes that may be better suited for the new conditions of that environment?
Yeah, and if you think the new conditions of that environment are what that wilderness should be evolving towards. And here becomes the question of naturalness. Let me give you an example that folks, Lisa used it there. We've got the Welcome Creek Wilderness area nearby here. It's really small, and it's surrounded by heavily logged and fragmented landscape here just south of Missoula. That wilderness will never be able to maintain itself in what we would consider a historically natural condition without some kind of intervention there. So we can make the choice, we're just going to simply set it aside as wilderness and let it evolve the way it is. It's one thing if you're going to look at the gates of the Arctic. In Alaska, we've got huge extensive areas where, we can largely let it free of it. But wilderness, particularly in the lower 48 and the varying different sizes of it, is going to present us ongoing more and more problems about that. And sure, if we want to prioritize the wildness and simply accept what comes about, we can do that. But we need to understand that most likely what comes about will not be natural in the sense of any historical reference site. It'll be a new complex of plants and diversities. It may be spotted knapweed adapts and simply becomes part of the ecosystem. We may not have a choice in that. But it does, what it forces us to do is to sit back and think, what is it that we really value about wilderness? Why do we value wilderness? And what is it in wilderness that we think needs to be preserved or maintained? There was some, hand here, Grant, and then Paul, and I know there have been some hands. The folks in the back wave more vigorously.
This debate about wilderness and naturalness and restoration is a very interesting one, but I think it's very important that we need to step back and we need to not look at restoration and naturalness and wilderness as a solution, because it's not a solution, it's a stopgap. And until there's a social consciousness and people have the courage to start talking about larger issues like population and consumption and those sorts of things, then this really essentially is going to fail eventually. And it's a matter of time. And people look at their lives and they think, okay, what can I give for wilderness and what can I give to restoration? And we need to reverse that and talk about what can I not give, what can I not consume, what can I restrict myself to. And so I guess my point there is that this is not a solution, and I think we're fooling ourselves if we think it is, that there's a really larger issue.
Yeah. Well, let me mention a point here why I'm so hopeful, and I'm still at the beginning points of thinking about this, but why I'm so hopeful about the third part of this talk, about looking at community participation within restoration. Because I think for wilderness, it's a very hopeful sign. When you become engaged in local restoration efforts of your own place there, you really very quickly begin to learn what it takes to maintain, to live sustainably or healthy in an area there. That in itself has some impact on your living standards there. So you have to really understand the ethic of restraint in our own consumption patterns in order to be able to restore local areas there. If we were successful in largely restoring a lot of the areas outside of wilderness, that in itself would go a long way towards addressing some of these difficult dilemmas we have in wilderness. Why are exotic weeds a threat to wilderness? Because the areas outside of them have become overrun with them. Why when we look at fire kinds of regimes and stuff, it's largely the areas outside of wilderness where we've suppressed it so long that make fire a problem for burning into wilderness. And so if we can begin to think in terms of a restoration paradigm or habitat that involves us in the areas we inhabit ourselves, and then take that to the really critical lifestyle choices about consumption, all these other things that drive the roots there, I think that's a very helpful complement. The other thing that I think is really fantastic about community participation in wilderness is you just learn so much. It's very, I'll be very honest, my earliest association with wilderness was the aesthetic appeal. I think it's really beautiful. But my early association with wilderness, I couldn't have told you an exotic versus a non-exotic in a lot of the places I visited because I simply was ignorant of the actual ecosystem kinds of things there. But when you get involved in restoration itself, you have to become educated in what's native and how and the complexity of these processes, and that has a spillover effect into understanding and preserving wilderness itself. So I think there's real potential for these two complementing each other. But you're exactly right. If we don't address the ecological issues outside of wilderness successfully, then the efforts to restore or maintain wilderness itself will be a losing battle because it simply can't withstand the assault on all these other fronts. Paul, did you have a...
Yeah, if this is off topic, you can feel free to skip me, but I'm wondering how you see restoration fits into human use spaces. I guess it's interesting to me that you use the analogy of guardians versus gardeners. Yeah. And specifically, the areas that we don't use for direct material nourishment. And it's also interesting to me that some of the examples are about taking land out of agriculture and restoring it to wilderness or a previous ecosystem. And so I'm wondering, where did it fit in? And also, the question comes from kind of the definition of sustainability that was put on PowerPoint earlier of ethics matched with, what was it? I don't even remember, but it didn't include human use. And that just strikes me, and I'm wondering if you want to speak at all how restoration might also play a role in human use.
Well, I think definitely. I mean, I'm trying to argue that restoration is one important component, but not the only component of an ethic of reinhabitation. That we need to really be examining the ways we inhabit our places, and clearly human use is a critical part of that. One of the examples that I eliminated for sake of time, but I think it's absolutely fascinating, is the group Homeward here in Missoula. They're combining developing rooftop gardens on their houses with using native plant restoration in some of the landscaping in that area there. And it's a really interesting example because it's clearly an urban, intensively human use place there. But it's combining both agriculture, using rooftop gardening, sustainable electrical things, good building materials, but they're also in the landscaping using native plants in a way. So it's integrating a lot of these things. What I'm particularly interested in is how we think about re-inhabiting our places that build to both ecological sustainability and social justice. And I think there are a lot of components to that. I mean, I work with Neva and looking at food systems kinds of things and how we do that in ways that clearly agriculture is intensive human use of lands that's very different than restoration. But I think they can go hand in hand. Again, I think they can complement rather than either or kinds of things. And so my own sense is the more that we restore ecological health and sustainability to a lot of our lands, it makes all the other parts much more viable. So sustainable local agriculture, for example, fits really well with restoration of local habitats. But it doesn't mean we still don't have to face these difficult choices about how to use which parts of lands and for what reasons on that. But I think we have so much degraded land out there that we've got lots of opportunities to start work on that before we have to worry about some of those narrow cases there. I know we're near the end of our time, and I wanted to give Grant a chance to make an announcement about an opportunity for people to participate in a local one, and also for folks who made it on this part of the room here. Yeah, I'm sorry. For those who are on this side of the room over here, there's a flyer out there on your desk. If you're interested in these issues, I am teaching a class this summer called Ethics, Fire, and Wilderness, Ethical Issues in Ecological Restoration. We'll spend about half of our time in the field looking at burn sites and other restoration sites, and really looking at how these issues we're debating here tonight take place in management decisions, other decisions there, as well as having several speakers come in and talk to us about that. So the flyers are there. There's more flyers available at Rankin Hall. Didn't make it to this side of the room here, but I'm happy to talk with people about it. It's a 3-credit class over a 6-day period this summer from June 20 to 25th, if anybody's interested in that. And Grant, do you want to mention what's going on with Five Valleys Land Trust?
I'll try to do this quickly. My name is Grant Bronk. I work with Five Valleys Land Trust. And what Five Valleys Land Trust does, we work with private landowners. We're not involved with wilderness, but we work with landowners in order to protect our agricultural heritage, our open spaces, and habitat. And my friend Jim Burkett and I, we work as land stewards, so we're very often on the land with landowners, talking to them about all the issues that they face. If they've grazed up to a stream too close, we try to talk to them about what can we do in order to better the situation. And more often than not, one thing that really holds these folks back is they don't have time, they don't have money, and they don't have enough people to get the job done. And Jim and I started writing grants and being shut down by grants, not obtaining the funds we needed, and got frustrated and decided, sometimes all it takes is just a couple of people picking up a shovel and you can make a difference. And we started this program called Hands on the Land 2 years ago, and now we have a pool of about 70 volunteers. We head out to private lands and we're restoring streams, we're restoring prairie, we're doing good work. And we'd like to keep this thing going. It's, like I said, we've got a pool of 70, but people are going to burn out. And we need volunteers to make this work. So I guess this is my way of asking if anybody is interested, if they want to get their hands dirty like we all should be. This is an opportunity to do so, and please call Five Valleys. I've got a few flyers if you'd like to take a look at them.
So you want to stand by the door, one of the doors on the way out and hand them out to people, or what's?
Sure, I can stand by the back door on this side.
Let's thank Dan very